All right, let's get started. Well, again, thank you everyone for joining me today for this FreightTech landscape series with the specific focus on how digitalization can save your supply chain. I'm Michael Johnson, or MJ, as a lot of my colleagues call me, and I've spent nearly 15 years in the supply chain. My career started in 2007 at Strive Logistics, where I had the opportunity to work across basically every function of the brokerage. While I was at Strive, for the first 3 years, I spent learning every aspect of the business. And what I saw was really a much bigger opportunity for the business to leverage technology and leverage data to better serve our customers, our carriers, and the operators that were running the business. And so with that, I created the blueprint for our TMS, which we called Load Runner. And it was really with a focus and a design to leverage data, drive more automation into our business, and power recommendation engines so that we could deliver a higher level of execution. Once we released Load Runner nearly a decade ago, we saw our growth soar, and we were able to truly measure and validate the impact that technology and digitalization can have on the business. And so I spent the next 8 years at Strive leading our strategy, operations, and technology teams before we were acquired by Redwood in early 2019. In my current role as the EVP of strategy at Redwood Logistics, I interface between the operations, strategy, and engineering teams, and I'm working to continue to advance our tech initiatives with a strong focus on growing our digital freight brokerage. Before walking through the outline of what we're going to cover today, I thought it was useful to share a stat I read recently. And it resonated with me because I think it speaks to why we're all talking about digitalization in the supply chain. And the stat was from a recent Gartner study. And what it said was, looking ahead into 2021 and beyond, 68% of companies are investing in digital supply chain planning, and it's their highest priority for digital investment as companies are looking to modernize, streamline, and strengthen their distribution strategies for the future. And so what I kind of took from that is that the future of supply chain is bright. And frankly, all of us have a responsibility and we all have a role to play in evolving the supply chain, making it more resilient, and just evolve how we all operate. We're going to cover the following topics today, starting with a quick look back on why the supply chain industry has been just slower to adopt technology and embrace digitalization. From there, we'll move on to some of the lessons we learned from 2020, and specifically, I think the impact such unpredictability had on supply chains, the impact they had on carrier networks, the impact they had on demand planning, routing guides, and order life cycles. I'll then share a market update and forecast for 2021, including some of the best practices that we're seeing shippers and carriers embrace so that they can navigate a market full of network uncertainties. I'll then go into some of the connectivity issues in logistics and how really the problems that exist today are going to be opportunities for the future. Finally, I'll share some of the new digital freight tech offerings that companies can embrace to just streamline and elevate their operations. I think it's worth mentioning that, from my perspective, we're all in the very early innings of massive innovation for the supply chain. You look at cloud-based solutions, APIs, data science, automation, machine learning, insert buzzword here, but all of these technologies, they're just starting to mature into the supply chain space. And I'm so excited to see what the next phase of this transformation of our industry looks like, and the opportunities it'll unlock for all of us and for just stronger network potential. The other thing I'll add is that never before have companies been so open to working together, collaborating, and innovating to drive efficiencies. More and more, I also see co-opetition in the logistics space as companies that were once competitors work together to solve problems that benefit both parties. I think trends in remote work will accelerate how ideas are being shared and then operationalized. So it gives me a lot of hope and a lot of excitement to look ahead and see where this industry is headed. So sluggish technology adoption and digitalization. Let's quickly look back at why our industry has been a laggard with technology adoption, what some of the hurdles have been, and frankly, why supply chain has fallen behind compared to so many other industries across the globe that have embraced the technology movement. Variability comes to mind. I think one of the biggest reasons technology innovation and digital solutions have been slow to emerge is because the problems in supply chain are hard. There's an enormous amount of variability in our supply chain and frankly, just variability from every lens. There's commodities across the supply chain that all have different requirements, and they're all different. And the complexity of goods that we're shipping means there's not a one-size solution, a one-size-fits-all solution for shippers when it comes to planning and execution. In addition, there's really no common technology standards that are ubiquitous across businesses. Even today, so many companies are still using antiquated systems and technology in their day-to-day operations. And it's the rigidness of these older systems and their limited ability to connect to supply chain partners that means just a more manual operations for the shippers, for their partners, for all members. Compound that with the fact that EDI, a one-way communication technology that was developed over 80 years ago, is still the most utilized method for exchanging data between companies. And it's easy to start to see how far behind so many companies in the supply chain are from using newer, faster and more flexible technology that we have available today. Finally, supply and demand volatility has made developing and then adopting new technology solutions difficult. There are thousands and thousands of factors that influence supply and demand, and no year is ever the same. And again, it just makes it difficult to create an out-of-the-box solution for all shippers in the market. I think across all of these themes, one thing is certain. Variability is really our new normal. And the most resilient supply chains, the supply chains that thrive in the next decade, they will be the front runners in adopting new technology that allows them to execute with agility and really respond to all of the variability in the supply chain. Next is the intricacy of shipping networks. The intricacy of shipping networks and the changes across them means that all of us are always going to be chasing better network utilization. If you look at the asset-based fleets in our industry, one of the most telling metrics that highlights the opportunity for better supply chain efficiency is fleet utilization. And the reality is the industry average for fleet utilization is currently around 50%. And I think that's a function of the fragmentation that exists from unique carriers across the country, as well as a function of the historically one-dimensional supply chain planning that we've used for years. And the fact that fragmentation exists not just across our carrier base, but across our technology systems. So if we double click on that first point, fragmentation is not just the 2 million plus unique drivers in the industry, but it's the thousands of disparate systems each of the carriers is using to power their business. It's the fact that these systems have trouble talking to one another. They have difficulty sharing data and optimizing network potential. And one-dimensional supply chain planning, as I mentioned, is the second biggest reason we're failing to realize much higher driver utilization and network potential. Historically, shippers have executed transportation planning based on their routing networks and their shipping networks. And I think what the supply chain is missing, and where I believe technology is headed and will support, is stronger network collaboration and planning across shipper networks so that we can drive higher utilization rates. We can reduce waste in terms of time, cost, and materials, and we can reduce the costs for parties across the supply chain ecosystem. Digital freight brokerages today are working to solve some of these problems for shippers and carriers by leveraging data, employing price and matching algorithms, and optimizing networks better. But we're going to see so much more upstream value when we start to solve some of the root cause of these problems, and we start to focus on platform connectivity and data sharing and upstream network collaboration and planning in the future. The rise of e-commerce has changed the supply chain game forever. You know, I think the Amazon effect is very real, and I think the shift in customer expectations is pushing the supply chain to function with so much more agility and transparency than ever before. Anecdotally, e-commerce growth has increased by over 100% since 2015. So in 5 years, e-commerce has doubled. And so with sales totaling $792 billion, it represents an enormous shift in how consumers are moving from brick and mortar. Consumption habits are changing, and online consumption is taking center stage. And so again, 100% growth from 2015 to 2020. So that means $400 billion of additional online sales have been generated in just the past 5 years. And that has a material impact on supply chain planning, network optimization, and inventory management. Last year, the pandemic only accelerated those trends. E-commerce sales between 2019 and 2020 were up 32.4%. So you can just see the shift that's happening, and you can see how consumers are pushing shippers and supply chains to the next level. The Amazon effect, as I mentioned, with same and 2-day shipping, I think mobile technology, and really just the fact that there's a lot more product options available to customers today. And all of those factors are forcing change in the supply chain. The companies that are going to thrive over the next decade, they're going to employ digital strategies. They'll collaborate with more partners. They'll leverage data and analytics. And they're going to develop and execute flexible supply chain platforms that can respond to these quick changes in consumption that we're seeing. They'll be able to respond to swings in supply and demand volatility. And they'll be built to respond to any other unexpected supply chain changes that will happen. So now we'll look back at some of the lessons learned from 2020. I think one of the biggest takeaways before we jump into the slides was how quickly the supply chain can change. And if you look at how volatile the market was based on these consumption changes, what we'll see in the next few slides is just how sharp the market dropped during the first few months of the pandemic, the impact that had on carriers, forcing so many into bankruptcy, and then how quickly demand not only rebounded, but snapped back to record highs in a matter of months. When we look at the volatility and the demand swings, we can truly start to appreciate the disruption to company routing guides, network planning, and really highlight the need for more flexible and digital supply chain tools. Here's a quick chart from FreightWaves, and what I wanted to highlight is just how quickly the rate per mile dropped when the pandemic started in mid-March of 2020, and how that persisted for 3 months. Over 3,000 trucking companies were forced out of business in 2020, and over half of those 3,000 went out of business in the 3 months you see highlighted with the red circle. So many companies went out of business because shipping stopped as states went into lockdown and non-essential shippers suspended operations. Freight flows dropped and rates per mile were below the operating costs that carriers had. And so the options were to park trucks or to go out of business, and it drove a lot of capacity out of the market. Just for context, in 2019, 1,000 trucking companies went out of business. So a 300% increase in 2020. As states began to open back up and manufacturers came back online, the impact these trucks coming off the road was felt across the supply chain. And it is the most drastic swing in truck stop recorded rate history that we've ever seen. As demand returned, it didn't just return, it surged. Spending was diverted from services to products, specifically home goods, home construction, remodeling materials, food and beverage, and all of our consumption habits changed. Most of us were, quarantined at home. We were eating at home instead of dining out. We were operating in remote work settings, and many people decided to take on those home improvement projects they'd been putting off. Adding to the growth in spending on goods has been the trillions of dollars in government-funded COVID relief, which trickles right back into the economy and accelerates consumption. So what we have is all of these shocks to consumption. So what have all of these shocks to consumption and demand meant for shippers? Well, it's meant massive network failures and routing guide compliance issues that shippers have been struggling with since last summer. As spot rates inflated far beyond contracted freight rates, carriers were left rejecting many of their contract commitments as they fought to turn a profit in the spot market. In addition, what this did is it created a massive imbalance in carrier networks. So the market itself was not running as efficiently as it was before the pandemic. And that's because of how many routes changed, how many companies went out of business, how many carriers went out of business. So with a market that was running inefficiently and carriers chasing the spot market, what this has led to is all-time highs in the tender rejection index, indicating that routing guides right now and some of really the one-dimensional weaknesses they've broken and they've failed. A number of the drivers that influenced market volatility in 2020 were the COVID-19 impact on drivers. Again, one of the reasons so many drivers left the industry was because rates did fall below an unsustainable level, and smaller carriers simply couldn't fund themselves through those depressed times. But there were also thousands of drivers that left the industry due to fear of contracting COVID. And if you remember, the large majority of the drivers on the road right now fall into the more experienced age group that would be more susceptible to risk from the COVID-19 virus. Compounding that problem has been driver schools and training. They were all shut down for several months, and that's halted driver recruitment efforts as demand whiplashed back and rebounded. New Class 8 truck orders right now are surging, but the long-term problem that remains is the lack of drivers to fill those trucks. And for those reasons, I think we're going to see capacity constraints pushed to their limits over the next couple months. Trends in e-commerce growth are going to continue to accelerate, and consumption of goods through 2021 is expected to remain strong as new spending comes back online and more people are vaccinated. Another trend we observed, especially in the back half of 2020, and that has pushed into 2021, is the execution of more frequent pricing cycles. As a result of all of the routing guide failures the industry saw in 2020, shippers were accelerating their pricing cycles in order to stabilize their acceptance and compliance on routing guides. We've seen an abundance of mini network bids, more frequent RFPs, and shippers trying to leverage market data insights and pricing indexes to benchmark what their freight costs are. And those trends are going to remain. And frankly, the rate transparency and the access to data in the market has never been stronger. And we're going to see more shippers gravitate towards that. I expect the popularity of more frequent pricing events to grow and eventually evolve into more dynamic rate execution. Contracted rates in the future are going to be anchored to market demand events. And I think we're going to see technology-driven dynamic adjustments on contracted pricing based on mutually agreed upon market indicators. And it will be for the benefit of the industry. Moving in this type of direction, it's going to encourage more routing guide compliance during periods of volatility. It will force down the tender rejection index, and it'll strengthen the relationships that shippers, carriers, and logistics companies have with one another, since there won't be the same incentive to abandon contracted rate agreements. Pushing the supply chain in the future towards more durable, but also flexible contracts will be a net positive. And ultimately, I think it's going to help us move in that direction of higher and longer term network and fleet utilization. So what does the market and our corresponding planning and execution look like in 2021? Well, the U.S. economy in 2021 is expected to make a strong V-shaped recovery. According to a study and a report by J.P. Morgan recently, our GDP is on a path right now that's going to put us well ahead of the pre-crisis, pre-pandemic trajectory. And again, just to review, some of the factors that are driving this growth are low inventories. Shippers have had to scramble to keep up with consumption demand, and inventories are at historically low levels. There's going to be more regional shipping trends to keep up with same and next day delivery expectations. And finally, I think trends in deurbanization and remote work are going to have an impact on the supply chain. There were a number of people that left highly populated, dense urban city centers and moved out into the suburbs. And so the impact that will have on consumption from some of the big box stores, as well as trends in people starting to work more in remote settings, dining at home more as a result, is yet to be seen. But I do believe consumption from big box and retail stores will grow, and it will have an impact on the supply chain. And just to support sort of that theory, a recent Wells Fargo poll that was run showed that 37% of millennials that currently live in the city were planning to leave within the next year. So it will be really interesting to monitor and measure the impact some of these changes have on the supply chain. Looking at the spot market in 2021, volumes, demand, really every indicator you could look at in the spot market is at an all-time high. Over the past 2 decades in the industry, what we've typically seen is that the high demand in the spot market creates a rise in rates on the contracted side. And so as more and more shippers and companies look to stabilize their routing guides and reduce tender and rejections, they increase their contracted rates. I think one of the things that's unique about this year, and different than some of the other market cycles we've experienced, is there are a number of headwinds we face on the driver recruitment side. As we mentioned, we had a number of drivers leave the industry due to COVID fears. We had our driver schools shut down, prolonging that training for new drivers coming in. And we also had a massive impact felt from the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse that has shrunk the eligible driver pool. And so again, I think the typical contracted freight rebound from these highs, it's going to persist. The spot market will persist longer, since it's going to take more drivers to come back into the market. One of the ways I think we'll accelerate drivers coming back in will be by offering higher wages. And frankly, I think higher wages for drivers is a trend we'll see continue and stay. On the previous slide, I was kind of pointing out the fact that we were at record highs. I read this figure yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, but it was basically published that in mid-March, the DAT recorded its highest weekly average rate on record. So I think that does speak to the sustained pressure that we feel in the spot market today. We're still a few weeks away from produce starting and really the peak summer shipping season. My expectation is that as more people are vaccinated, there's going to be a much higher activity in travel and consumption and just spending overall. My feeling is that as people start to come out of their houses after being holed up for over a year, this summer they're going to feel safer to go out and they're going to start dining out again. They're going to travel and they're going to spend money. And I think that's going to transfer over in the services side. But as we've seen with the GDP forecast, it's also expected to transfer over into material goods, which is going to create additional demand on the supply chain. This is just another view of the significant drop in truck loadings we saw, but I thought this was relevant to share because it does point out sort of that V-shaped rebound we saw that really started to climb back late last summer, and that's persisted since then. And then finally, this is a great slide that shows how many new carriers are coming into the market. And I think it can be confusing, but this does not necessarily mean new capacity is coming into the market. If we look back at some of the strong spot environments we saw in 2014 and in 2018, we saw a lot of new trucking companies formed. And what happens is the older drivers typically leave the larger fleets and they work as owner operators or as smaller fleets exclusively in the spot market. And so essentially, as long as this market continues to pay high rates in the spot market, we're going to see a lot of new for-hire trucking companies get new carrier authorities. What remains to be seen is how the net population of our total drivers accelerates. And I think that's really going to be the indicator to watch in the future. And then lastly, just looking at truckload rates, you would expect the inflection point in the spot market to happen sometime this summer. You can get a really good feel for the typical 3-year cycle that we've seen in our industry over the last 2 decades by looking at this graph. The reason I believe this year will be a little different is I think the spot market is going to sustain, as we've mentioned. There's a number of tailwinds driving it, namely the driver shortage, but also this perfect storm of other activity. There's strong industrial growth right now. We have historically low inventories. There's stimulus money flowing back into the economy. We have a record stock market, and we have a healthy consumer sentiment. So my feeling looking ahead is I wouldn't be surprised if we see strength in the spot market until our next RFP cycle towards the end of this year. Other trends to look for in 2021 include a more regional delivery model and trends in nearshoring. More shippers are going to shift to shorter and more localized supply chain execution in order to better serve their customers and to keep their products on shelves in a faster way. Manufacturing costs that rise due to nearshoring will be offset by agility. It'll be offset by lower transportation and logistics costs. And I think it also de-risks some shippers because of some of the ongoing US and China trade war that's played out for a couple of years. So my guess is look for supply chains to become more regional, look for shippers to partner with logistics companies and supply chain companies that can help them execute more flexible and agile distribution strategies. And finally, forecasting tools and inventory management technology, that'll continue to take center stage as well. The ironic part of the pandemic is I think it really highlighted the limitations some technology does have in responding quickly to big market shifts. Machine learning and AI are excellent tools when we're in a stable environment. And so as we start to get to a new normal, those tools will continue to be leveraged and help shippers and supply chain companies optimize their networks. But I think understanding the limitations those technologies have, machine learning and AI specifically, also places a spotlight on the need for agile supply chain partners so that shippers, when there are disruptions in market shocks, can quickly and efficiently navigate the fluctuations in the market, up or down. And lastly, the last big trend we're going to see in 2021 is greater platform connectivity. The largest TMS providers, the largest supply chain vendors, carriers, shippers, logistics companies, you name it, are all moving towards a world where everyone is more hyper connected, and where open technology platforms are able to deliver more customized solutions for their constituents. In addition, these cloud-based platforms they enable real-time collaboration and more flexible execution. So this is where I think TMS platform connectivity and collaboration are going to unlock, this multi-dimensional planning state across the supply chain, and provide tremendous value to everybody. So how are some ways the industry can address the connectivity issue? Let's start with what some of the problems are. As we discussed, connectivity is a problem that exists today. Bringing together parties in the supply chain, connecting systems, and orchestrating processes and business rules is still a gap that exists for many members of the supply chain community. I think even at the largest companies, what you'll see is there are a ton of manual processes that exist today, specifically as it relates to quoting, building new orders, scheduling and planning, quality control, carrier assignment, tracking, freight pay and audit, you name it. And there is a large subset of technology that can address each of those problems. But what we're missing and what we lack is a common platform to pull all of the disparate technology systems together and harmonize that data across platforms for end-to-end solution execution. And so connectivity is also the solution. One example of a connectivity solution that's coming onto the scene, and I'll dive into more, is rating API technology. I think 2020 was a year where we saw more of the digital freight brokerages start to deploy this rating API technology for shippers. And what it did was several things for shippers. It removed the friction from the quoting experience. It allowed shippers to respond to changes in the market, have flexible capacity, and also have price transparency in real time, so that planners can quickly and confidently plan for overflows, or also perhaps index the market to see how their contracted rates compare to the market rates. Connected tracking solutions today are allowing shippers and logistics providers to set up, different exception-based workflows based on all of the real-time location updates coming in. I think if you look at tracking solutions as a whole, you'll see that it was one of the first technologies to come onto the scene that really started to focus on connecting the different supply chain members with one source of the truth and transparency and visibility to location updates. And then finally, new digital freight brokerage technology is automatically connecting freight opportunities from shippers to the best qualified carriers. I'll get into that in a bit as well, but moving into the future, by automating the carrier selection process using data and with confidence and with speed, it provides everyone with time and cost savings, which is ultimately going to deliver more network potential and greater efficiencies. So what does data connectivity look like today? Well, this is a maze of connectivity, and I think it does a good job illustrating the hyper fragmentation that exists in the supply chain today. And so just like we have enormous carrier fragmentation, we have enormous technology fragmentation. And there are tons and tons of point-to-point connectivity and point-to-point connections that are set up. And these connections are expensive, they're risky, they're complex, they take time to set up, the connections become brittle as more are added. And ultimately, the supply chain operators continues to have to ask IT to manage essentially what is logistics and data and how all that works, instead of focusing on the core competency of their business. And so at Redwood, our belief is the industry is moving towards a more connected ecosystem. Redwood Connect, which is part of the logistics platform as a service model at Redwood, is one solution we believe will allow supply chain partners to connect once and then have universal reusability. They'll be able to have scale, security, etc. And if organizations, if shippers, if carriers, if logistics companies can connect once to a one-to-many cloud-based platform and outsource the management of all of that plug-and-play connectivity for all of their vendors, their carriers, etc., it will then allow their IT teams to focus on the competitive advantage at that company, and not on the orchestration and the maintenance between all of the different disparate systems their partners use. These types of solutions will also allow companies to increase their integration velocity, receive value from digital connectivity quicker, and reduce their IT spend as a function of setting up network integrations and maintaining them. Moving into digitalization and FreightTech offerings, we're going to spend some time walking through each of the digital solutions that exist in the industry today. I think, to start, TMS platforms, they've been around for years, but if you haven't taken a look at your TMS platform today, I think it's worth examining that. There have been advances in elevating the performance and functionality of TMS systems. And frankly, the tier one TMS platforms are changing so rapidly, and they're evolving to become more open source and dynamic. And there's certainly opportunity for you to leverage that new flexibility if you aren't already. I think the role API connectivity has had on advanced communication between partners in the supply chain, namely the impact they've had on making real-time tracking ubiquitous, and also delivering real-time quotes and pricing. That's only going to accelerate, especially as the wallet share of digital freight brokerage continues to grow. And then there's new digital freight brokerages that are gaining scale. And one of the new concepts I think is going to continue to take hold is, how do we share marketplace and capacity insights to better leverage that data and to share it across supply chain constituents and ultimately lower costs? Looking at TMS platforms, the following platforms, these are all tier one solutions. And I think what's staggering about the four providers you see on your screen is, across the four top TMS providers, they manage 35% of the domestic trucking spend in North America. And so that's a tremendous amount of over-the-road volume. And again, I think as the industry continues to evolve, they'll be able to leverage cross-shipper collaboration in ways that haven't been done before. And that's going to deliver more efficient route and network planning, and subsequently higher levels of fleet utilization. Let's move past 50% industry fleet utilization as our high watermark. Let's work across our shipper networks. Let's leverage the fact that four providers have insights into cross shipper collaboration, and let's drive more network utilization across the industry. The use of APIs in the supply chain has, I think, exploded primarily to the three companies you see on your screen. All of these companies have been working for the past decade at advancing tracking data and centralizing how tracking updates are stored and managed. And the downstream operational benefits of leveraging that data has been significant. These companies and I would say they really were the pioneers to validating the purpose of API connectivity in the supply chain ecosystem. But now that they've taken center stage, I expect APIs will take over the role of EDI as the business-to-business transmission channel. Like I mentioned, rating API connectivity really exploded onto the scene in 2020. And in 2021, we'll have an even bigger impact. Within Redwood's digital freight brokerage alone, we saw a surge in demand in quotes and loads executed through our own rating API solution, as that rating API solution provided flexible capacity. It provided guaranteed capacity, and it provided real-time insights for shippers to be able to make decisions quickly and confidently. Those types of flexible capacity solutions through rating APIs are going to help shippers augment failed routing guides. And until we move away from, the one-dimensional nature of a waterfall tender and a routing guide, I think rating APIs are going to augment that process nicely. Some of the other operational benefits are just streamlining the operational process for the shipper, the brokerage, and the carrier. We can remove friction points and time-consuming quote requests through emails, through phone calls, and we can deliver rates back in less than 1 second. In addition, utilizing data as the source for delivering the real-time quotes saves time from leveraging a pricing analyst. And it also normalizes and gives a higher level of quality control over the quote experience. Here are 4 ways. A lot of the shippers we work with are 4 reasons why they're moving towards the rating API solution. I think the first one goes without saying, but it allows them to easily compare rates for both their contracted and non-contracted freight. The rates are typically delivered within the TMS our shippers operate within a second, and it allows the shippers and the planners to execute directly from the environment they're using today to plan freight. These solutions provide flexible capacity. So again, during times of volatility, it allows shippers to quickly respond to market gyrations with confidence and with also full rate transparency. It allows shippers to avoid paying premiums. There's significant cost avoidance that shippers can achieve by utilizing and executing market responsive rates that are anchored based on real data and not the gut or feel of a pricing analyst at a brokerage. And finally, one of the biggest benefits for all parties is how these solutions allow you to streamline operations. Rating APIs allow you to create automated workflows and really lower your cost to serve no matter which side of the fence you sit on. And so by doing this, I think we're going to see more competitive rates from the largest digital freight brokerages, more scale acquired, and stronger network effects that benefit the shipping community. Moving on to digital freight brokerage. This is another massive effort that we're seeing underway within the logistics industry right now. And by leveraging data and capacity networks to automate carrier selection, to automate pricing and load tendering, we're creating a much more scalable business model to execute on behalf of the shippers. And the downstream benefits for shippers is going to be higher velocity in assigning carriers to their freight. I think they're going to have much stronger and more competitive pricing from digital freight brokerages. And I think over time, as the digital freight brokerages that acquire scale continue to build their flywheel and leverage the network effect within their business, they're going to provide much more competitive prices to both shippers and to carriers as they continue to find the best carrier for the freight available. Over the next 8 years alone, digital freight brokerage is expected to grow to an $89 billion industry. And so that's a staggering number to think about. But between now and 2028, the digital freight brokerage industry size alone is expected to be greater than the traditional brokerage industry today. And I think what's also worth sharing on this slide is the traditional freight brokerage industry, it's also expected to scale. And so outsourced logistics in general is going to grow tremendously as more shippers partner with logistics companies for flexible capacity, for collaboration, and for more efficient network planning. Finally, one of the areas I see huge potential is as digital platforms continue to emerge and they help shippers, brokers, and carriers, how can we leverage shared capacity across these digital platforms to benefit shippers, logistics providers, and carriers, propel better network utilization and lower costs for all? You know, in the screenshot you see here, this is a great visual of the capacity networks that we have created at Redwood that power our digital freight brokerage. And at any given time, there are roughly 100,000 pieces of tractor equipment within our private network. How do we, unleash that potential for shippers so that we can commercialize and deploy digital freight brokerage solutions, digital freight matching solutions for them to utilize, apply exception-based logic and really democratize their access to that private capacity and use that as a competitive advantage for their operation. So more to come on this subject, but it's definitely a trend I expect to see more and more of. And so that really kind of brings the presentation to an end. I know I covered a lot, and unfortunately this FreightTech series does not have a Q&A, but I did put my email address on this last slide. So please email me, reach out if you have any questions. Definitely look for me on LinkedIn to connect. And if there are any follow-ups or questions or just answers I can provide, I would love to hear from you. So please definitely connect with me on LinkedIn or shoot me an email. And thank you everyone for attending today and sharing this time with me. Bye everyone.